at the University of California at Berkeley, Stanford University, and John Hopkins University. Most recently, from 2015 to 2019, Dr. Kachins was a research professor at Georgetown University Law School of Foreign Service, where he taught and ran the Russia Futures program. Before that, he directed the Russia and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and directed the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, including running the Carnegie Moscow Center for 3 years. He has authored, edited, and co-authored 7 books on the region, Central Asia, more than 150 book chapters, monographs, reports, journal articles, and policy papers on the regions. And he's frequently called upon by the global media, governments, and leading private sector companies and investors for consultations on this issue. His most recent article, What is Eurasia for Us, for the United States, was published in a special issue of Strategic Analysis Journal, and then come into the book chapter of the Roads and Belts of Eurasia, edited by our laboratory by its head, Professor Alexander Lukin, and published earlier this year by Palgrave Macmillan. In many respects, this is the topic of our today's meeting. Professor Kachins was going to talk about American policy in Eurasia. I'll be in charge for the moderating today. I think, as usual, we'll have a 30-40 minutes talk, and then we can move to the Q&A session. The questions could be sent via chat, which is available in the right. So here, I have a pleasure to deliver the words to Professor Kachins.
Well, Dmitry, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And thanks especially to my dear old friend, Alexander Vladimirovich Lukin, for the invitation to speak for this forum, which is a kind of apropos in that in my current position, which I took in May of last year, I became the president of the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek. So I have been located smack dab in the middle of Eurasia, so to speak, for the last nearly a year, although I'm actually speaking to you today from Moscow because with the it's coronavirus related, of course. My flight back to Kyrgyzstan a month or so ago was canceled, and so now I am happily stranded in Moscow, one of my favorite cities. So this topic, in a way, I was working in think tanks for 15 years in the U.S., the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I was getting kind of tired of it, frankly. A lot of times people go in and out of think tanks and they'll go into the work in administration. Since I was a little kid, I wanted to be the Secretary of State, but I found myself at about 55 years old, and it seemed that my chances to become Secretary of State were not increasing. And I got tired of writing pieces that were of very short shelf value. And I wanted to write about some bigger things. So one of the first things I took on was the topic that I had worked on for most of my professional life, and that is trying to build better mutual understanding and relations between the United States and Russia, which of course, after about 30 years, I had to declare myself a complete failure in that exercise. But I decided, I moved to Georgetown University and I undertook a project to try to understand why each US administration that had come to power after the collapse of the Soviet Union seemed to follow this pattern of initially a honeymoon and good relations, and then things went sour. And to make a long story short, I interviewed about 50 people on both the Russian and the U.S. side who had taken part in major policy positions. And the short conclusion was that there were different expectations on both sides. Basically, I think the Americans were very disappointed that Russia didn't make a more smooth transition to what Washington viewed as a liberal market democracy. And from Moscow's side, I think the feeling was that the United States had violated kind of an informal agreement that Washington would not take advantage of Moscow during a time of relative weakness in the 1990s. It's a much longer story. But the other area that I was becoming much more interested in was Central Asia. And what does Eurasia mean? And when I talk about Eurasia, I talk about the big Eurasia, the Halford Mackinder, the geopolitician, great geopolitician, British geopolitician in the late 19th century, early 20th century, from Europe to China, Russia to India, the greater Middle East, and Southeast Asia. And my question was, I didn't think that the United States, had a very successful policy toward Eurasia. I don't think it had a very good comprehension of what its policy was. And so that what led me to write, which was first an article and then a revision for Sasha's book, but it was designed to be a book project, actually. I've done a lot of work on this. But the short version is that if we look at just taking the US policy toward Eurasia from the collapse of the Soviet Union, I would identify three phases. And the first phase starts with the collapse, and it goes until 9/11. And the policy then was most focused on Russia. A second period lasted from 9/11 till sometime in the Obama administration. It's a little hard to identify. I think when they began to think a little bit more seriously about their pivot to Asia, which I'll return to later. But that was really focused on Eurasia. It was about fighting wars in Eurasia, and the Afghan and Iraq wars demanded most of US policymakers' time and efforts with those wars. And the third section, the third period, which we're still living in and evolving in, is it's more China dominated from the United States standpoint as it sees Eurasia. But there's one consistently, I'd argue, through the whole 30-year period, and I think a lot of people miss this. When the George H.W. Bush administration, when it was in its last year of power, the Soviet Union had collapsed. The United States was the lone superpower of the world in what looked to be a unipolar moment in history, financially, militarily, etc. Tremendous power. There was a strategy that was developed within the Defense Department. And it was in the Defense Department when, at that time, the chairman of the Defense Department, the head of the Defense Department, was Richard Cheney, who returns to the story later on. And the essence of the policy, which it came through in an NSC policy document in 1992, was that the United States' core strategy was to prevent a peer competitor from emerging from the supercontinent of Eurasia. That's it. A peer competitor emerging from Eurasia. And looking at things in the early 1990s, well, who were the potential candidates who could be that competitor? Well, I would say three: Europe, China, and Russia. I say for China, it was premature. It was still very early in their growth, remarkable growth pattern. Europe was really reaching its peak moment in unification, but it was a unification that was not really designed against the United States. Some of those urges would come later. So then the third possible competitor, of course, was Russia. And there the view was, well, what if Russia moves away from its democratic reforms, moves away from its market reforms, and becomes a revanchist country and kind of resumes itself in sort of a Soviet Union light or something like that. So this was always why, from the very beginning, there was a certain hedging on the part of the United States policymakers about Russia on a lot of issues. I would point to one, why was the United States so enthusiastic about the immediate independence of the Baltic states? You can understand. There was more of there was a better historical argument there. But why be so enthusiastic about the independence and the sovereignty of the other new states, which none of them had experienced sovereignty within those borders, and they're in borders that were designed by Joseph Stalin back in the early 1920s. These are borders which left Russia about 1/3 of this, with about 30% less of its territory and about 50% less of its population. Well, I don't think it takes a genius to figure out why that could be attractive in the minds of some Americans who are concerned about the possibility of a revanche and a return of Russia. But it's never talked about that way in U.S. policy. But it is striking to me, especially when I look at it in retrospect, how sacrosanct for U.S. policymakers those borders became. And again, for most of us scholars who understand the reasons why those borders emerged, well, you have to look a little bit more skeptically, perhaps. At any rate, so U.S. policy was focused on promoting democracy, promoting market reform, promoting human rights, promoting rule of law in not only Russia, but all of the new states of the former Soviet Union. But it was especially interested in promoting the sovereignty of the new states. And the most significant tool which that sovereignty was to be shown was through the building of oil and gas pipelines, which would go west and which would evade Russian territory and would make these countries less dependent upon the oil and gas pipeline network of the Soviet Union. American diplomats always talked about, well, happiness is multiple pipelines. And the Russians, looked at, yeah, well, happiness is, we kind of preferred the pipelines going through our territory. So that didn't, it was not a very well received message. You could see right through the strategic interests that were behind it. Nevertheless, the decade went on, and increasingly the disappointment between the two sides became greater. With the financial crash in 1998 and the war in Kosovo in 1999, things reached rock bottom. So that was the main period of U.S. policy toward Eurasia. Nobody ever talked about the term of Eurasian integration, with the exception of Mr. Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, but it wasn't really certainly wasn't on people's minds in Washington. Now that was going to change quickly on 9/11 and the reaction to 9/11, when suddenly U.S. foreign policy and military forces immediately were focused on Afghanistan, understandably, since the attack of Osama bin Laden had come from Afghanistan. The Taliban had allowed for Osama bin Laden and his colleagues to be there. So that's a normal place for the attack to go. And it was initially very successful. The Russians were amongst our most supportive allies in the early stages of that war, along with the Iranians, by the way. The Iranians and the Indians and the Russians had been kind of, maybe not in a very coordinated way, but certainly had strong interests against the kind of Sunni Wahhabi Islam that was being promoted by the ISI in Pakistan and the Saudis, etc. So that was very successful. Maybe it was almost too successful. It happened too quickly, and that if it had taken a little bit more time, there would have been more time for the United States and Russia to actually engage in a very significant international security issue that was successful. But I would argue still that was the most robust period of security cooperation between Russia and the United States that took place in the last 30 years. But we know the story. There were those in the Bush administration who wanted to go to Iraq. They went to Iraq. And like in Afghanistan, things initially in Iraq went very, very well. But then things started not to go so well in Iraq. Afghanistan was kind of put on the back burner. Then things were going so poorly in Iraq that it was General Petraeus and his idea of the surge, which was brought in 2007, basically saved the Americans from a defeat in Iraq at that time. Now, a political campaign was going on in the United States. And Barack Obama was not a very well-known politician. And I remember making a bet on January 1st, 2008 with a group of friends of mine we were on a ski vacation, and I was the only one that bet on that day that Barack Obama would be the next president of the United States. I made the bet kind of on a whim because I'd read his book, Letters to My Father, and it was so well written, and he was such a smart and thoughtful guy that I just had a lot of faith in him. But what's the real story? Why did Barack Obama defeat Hillary Clinton? He did so because, in my view, he did not have to take a vote on the Senate floor in March of 2003, yay or nay, on the war in Iraq, whereas Hillary Clinton had, all the mainstream Democrats had, and they all kind of fell in line with this sort of this militaristic euphoria that was running around in Washington after 9/11. The psychology of the country had really dramatically changed. And Obama, he couldn't be against both wars because since he had no foreign policy, no national security credos, he couldn't say that he was against both the Iraq war and the Afghan war. So, he said, Afghanistan's the good war and Iraq is the bad war. So he gets elected, he comes to power, and he finds out, gee, this Afghan war really isn't so good. But nevertheless, he gets talked into a massive expansion of U.S. military, U.S. and ISAF presence there. But there's no strategy, really. There's no strategy at all. And this is when I became interested in Afghanistan for the first time since the Soviet-Afghanistan War. Because a colleague of mine at CSIS had dinner with General Petraeus in January of 2009, right after Petraeus had come back from Uzbekistan and Central Asia, where he was starting to negotiate the new transit corridors to bring non-lethal goods, some military supplies, for what was expected to be a much larger number of American troops. I can tell you a long story about that, but I'll spare you. But it sounded like a really, and he came and said, Andy, this sounds like a really interesting project. And I said, yeah, it does. Because I've been trying to get a grip on, what is happening in Eurasia. My sense was that Eurasia was reconnecting, and it was reconnecting because you had, three big economies, Russia, China, and India, that basically for a lot of the 20th century had not been engaged in the world economy. That changed in China in 1978. It changes in Russia with the collapse in 91. Changes in India with more market reforms in the mid 90s, and these economies start growing very rapidly. The EU is actually a going operation, and so these large economies, other than smaller emerging countries like Turkey and Iran and Pakistan, are also in the mix. And they're all around this area where the epicenter is kind of Afghanistan. So it was that was a kind of a fascinating hook for me. Is how do you get actually all of these materials to support troops in Afghanistan? 85 to 90% of what supports U.S. military troops in theater are non-lethal goods, and they're transited by civilian carriers. And at that time, when Petraeus first went to Central Asia, the problem is that all of the U.S. military goods were coming into the port of Karachi, and then they were coming by trucks up to the northwest into the Torkham and Shaman gates. So this transit corridor was overloaded. Two, the port operators, the trucking industry, they had tremendous leverage from negotiating with the United States. And Petraeus's idea was, well, look, we're going to need a much bigger footprint, and so we're going to need other transit corridors to compete with this and to get enough supplies there. And that's when we got involved, and we did this. It was called the Northern Distribution Network. And that's what got me thinking about a modern Silk Road strategy for Afghanistan. It was pretty amazing to be in Washington and to hear the debates about Afghanistan in 2009 and 2010. The debates were pretty much all about, well, is it counterterrorism or is it counterinsurgency? And the other question is, how many more troops? And I thought, wow, well, that's a pretty narrow look about sort of a military political strategy. At the time, Afghanistan was 90+ dependent upon international assistance for economic development. You've got to be thinking about a viable economy for Afghanistan in the longer term for this to work. And for that, then its neighbors should be involved, blah, blah, blah. I won't, if anybody wants to talk about that, I'll be happy to. I spent a lot of time on that for about 2.5 years. But essentially, Obama announces in December of 2010 that he's upping the amount of troops in Afghanistan up to over 100,000, but he's going to start withdrawing them in 18 months. Okay, that's just crazy. That's just crazy. So what if I'm the Taliban, okay, I'm going to go to the mountains for a while and I'll wait out these Americans. They're going to go and we'll still be here. But basically, the Obama administration had lost its interest in Afghanistan, and this is what sort of transits to the third period of U.S. policy toward Eurasia. And people started to wake up to the fact that since 1991, the Chinese economy had grown by factors of multiple X. The Chinese had already replaced the Russians as the dominant economic power in Central Asia. The Chinese were undertaking a lot of projects which very soon they would put under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative. But what struck the Americans' attention initially, of course, was the Chinese aggressive actions vis-a-vis Philippines, Japanese, South Korea, and around the South China Sea. So they started to talk about a pivot to Asia. And then they thought, oh, pivot maybe sounds too alarming. So we'll call it a rebalancing toward Asia. But the Chinese, it was obvious to the Chinese and anybody with a brain in their head that what was going on is that the United States was looking for ways to contain Chinese growth and was concerned about it and wanted to allocate less of its troops in Europe and less of its troops certainly in Eurasian land wars. That was the idea. Not a bad idea in principle, but and there were some good aspects to it. One terrific idea I thought was the Asia Pacific APP. Sorry, I'm forgetting the for the trade grouping that would bring together and raise norms amongst Pacific. It's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. Thank you. And that was a good idea. And countries signed on to that. About 11 of them signed on to that. Of course, it was a little bit weird that the Americans were they wanted to exclude the Chinese from the TPP, but nevertheless, there was a lot of enthusiasm about it because all of Chinese neighbors, even the Russians, had some degree of nervousness about the rapid growth of the Chinese economic power and hence the political power that comes with it. And the Chinese were certainly concerned about it. And I think it's one of the factors that led the Chinese to put more oomph into what became known as the Belt and Road Initiative. But the Asian pivot got derailed mainly because of the Arab Spring, Syria, and then of course Ukraine. And so that distracted the attention of US policymakers from trying to make this Asia pivot to the extent that they could. And nevertheless, the Chinese, Xi Jinping, were moving forward from 2013 to 2016 and expanding the Belt and Road Initiative, the very successful establishment of the Asian Investment, the AIB, and then what was the United States policy response to it? Well, it was either they didn't take it very seriously, or even worse, they were advising their allies to not engage, with this project, and particularly the AIIB. And it was very embarrassing, I think, for the Americans when key European partners and others joined the AIIB, and we were left out. But then that brings us to Mr. Trump. And how does Mr. Trump view Eurasia to the extent that he knows what Eurasia is? Well, initially, there seemed to be some mixed feelings about the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think it's because there are significant commercial interests in the Trump administration that saw some potential there. But over a short period of time, and by late 2017, it was clear that the administration was taking a very negative stance toward the Belt and Road Initiative, toward China in general. And if you look at the U.S. defense strategy policy that emerged in, I think it was December 2017, it was described in terms that were kind of like Halford Mackinder meets sort of democratic idealists. And basically, the argument was the United States needs to support the island democracies, and here India was included as a democracy, along with Japan, Australia, and of course the United States being an island, to counter the two authoritarian continental states. It was straight up sort of geopolitics plus neoconservatism. It was an interesting combination. I'm sure Mr. Trump really had no idea, that's what it was about, and he fired the National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, who was responsible for that. But if we look at American policy toward Eurasia today, a lot of it is about, and I see it a lot in living in Kyrgyzstan, a lot of it is about countering Russia and China, and that China and Russia are referred to as these malign powers who were thwarting U.S. interests and doing all of these bad things. And it's become kind of reified in the State Department and in U.S. foreign and security policy to a degree that is surprising to me, in that Mr. Trump doesn't really know or care anything about foreign policy except to the extent which he thinks that we can make money off of it. But thinking in these strategic terms is not his game. But that is those. You talk about, there are various wings of the deep state in the United States, and it's this wing of the deep state, which is a curious blend of kind of far right wing and far left wing, who are sort of, they both converge in an ideological belief about the mission of America and the city on the hill and democracy and markets, etc. Plus a rather oversimplified view of continental politics. So, just for example, and I'll close on this point because I've been talking long enough. There's this expectation that since we've dedicated India now as an island democracy, that they will naturally be inclined to, march in lockstep with UN foreign policy interests. There's some things that I think that Delhi will agree with, but there are a number of things that Delhi will not agree with, and they will be very, very wary, I think, of being viewed as some kind of lackey of the United States. So let me conclude. Okay, if the policy goal in the first place was to prevent the emergence of a peer superpower on the Eurasian continent, you know, okay, that's been successful for 30 years. That hasn't happened. And I don't think that anybody will be able to control Eurasia. It's a multipolar environment with a lot of different powerful countries, and it's um, even if China has its best case scenario economic development, they're not going to have the resources to pull off this sort of position as economic hegemon. So then why? So maybe well, I'll leave it at that. That's where I am. Thanks for listening. Let's have a conversation.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you for a very interesting and insightful talk. Actually, I would like to disagree with your criticism of the American policy in Eurasia, because actually miscalculations of the American policy is one of the key drivers of its consolidation and all our Greater Eurasia initiatives here. But I think that...
Well, yes, are you saying that U.S. Eurasian policy is very, very good for Russia?
Yeah. So, well, it depends, but actually, I think there should be some questions. You can actually use the function raise your hand is if you would like to address a question to Andrew, or you can send a question via chat, which is on the right. And I think that I may start with my own question. I will use my position of a moderator. So could America, from your point of view, change its policy in Eurasia to a more constructive, and what it could mean actually, a more constructive American policy in Eurasia?
Well, I think a more constructive American policy in Eurasia would be not to simply designate countries as sort of innate enemies or of the United States, or that they are completely opposed to the interests and the goals of the United States. Iran is a country I would put in this category. For sure, it's been very frustrating to me for my entire adult life that we actually do not have normal we don't have normal diplomatic relations with Iran. And there are a lot of things that, Iran was extremely helpful in 2001 and 2002 in helping to take down the Taliban, support for the Northern Alliance, other intelligence cooperation. And what was their reward? Well, the reward was that in January of 2002, President Bush, put them in this absurd formulation called the axis of evil. Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. The idea that Iraq and Iran, who had fought a brutal war throughout the 1980s, were somehow, working together against the United States was just insane. But there's a tendency, just as a starting point, Dmitry, there's a starting point. There's a tendency to people to look at Americans to look at things in very black and white ways, and not to understand nuances and how interests can vary by country in many ways. So for example, Russia. The American view of Russia has been very Europe-centric for so long. So we see what happens in 2014 with the Crimea and the war in the Donbass, and you have a lot of people in the American establishment talking about this in terms of being the most egregious threat to U.S. security since 9/11 or to Pearl Harbor. And I'm just going like, what are you talking about? But I think that stems from an overly Eurocentric perception of Russia. Simultaneously, the Russians were looking to improve relations with Japan. And I was trying to argue to the Obama administration that that Russia looks at Europe and it looks at Asia and it looks at U.S. position in Europe and it looks at U.S. position in Asia in different ways. That may be less true today than it was 6 years ago, but that we should be more supportive of Russian and Japanese rapprochement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. I think we have to hope for the changing in the U.S. policy in Eurasia. So I believe that Alexander Vladimirovich also wants to address a question to you.
Yes. Alexander Lukin, the instigator, zachynshik of the seminar.
Provocateur.
Yeah. So I'll ask a provocative question, which is kind of philosophical. Well, as you said, the United States has a messianic vision, let's say, and it always had it, because like from colonial times, because messianic people came to America in the first place. But at the same time, in foreign policy, usually it accepted that there are other imperfect countries in the world, and you have to deal with them somehow, without trying to improve them that much. In the 19th century, and during First World War, during the Second World War, it managed even to be an ally of the Soviet Union, which was much more imperfect than Russia is now from this point of view. But I think in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, something happened with the United States foreign policy ideology, let's say, or vision. It decided that they can improve the world very soon, and the entire world. And so it's very difficult now, I think, for the United States to accept that there are other big countries in the world which are not improvable in a short period, at least, like China, like Russia, like some other countries,
like the United States.
Well, the United States is always perfect in general for every American, but of course they want people like you would like to improve something in the United States now, I'm quite sure, but it's a different level from China, because it's still on balance, it's still a perfect country, or at least a very, very good country. But even from that point of view, I think if the United States cannot come to its normal policy, come back to its normal policy from this very short period, from the 1990s, it will be very difficult for it to exist in this world, because it's losing its influence in the world objectively. It's like share of world GDP is going down, and general influence is, I would say, going down. But the illusion of world domination, let's call it, is still there. So the question is, can you improve? I mean, can you change this attitude to a more traditional one? Because if you don't, it will be very difficult for the United States and for other countries. It will lead at some point to serious confrontation.
I agree with the premise of your question, Sasha. something happened. There was a great opportunity in 1991 um, uh, to reshape the world, uh, like uh, like a lot of so-called wise men did back in 1944 and 1945, kind of shaped the era that took after them. But what I felt, I was not very confident that the United States would be able to do it because of hubris, and that we would be overly influenced by this sense of power, overwhelming power that we thought we had. And remember, in the 1990s, it wasn't just military power, but it was also economic power. The dot-com boom, the high-tech economy, that was all going on. And I think that the United States lost a sense of, well, it lost a sense of a need for a strategy. Because I think when you feel like you can do anything, when you feel like you have the means to do anything, and that the costs of doing that are relatively small, then what do you need a strategy for? But I thought we very quickly should have come to understand that for me the unipolar moment. And actually, I liked a quotation of your longtime Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Viktorovich, who said that the unipolar world evaporated in the sands of Iraq. But there were two things that were happening. It wasn't only that the efficacy, the utility of the application of military power to achieve political goals was shown to be, and would increasingly be shown to be, very dubious, but also the U.S. dot-com boom came to a crash. So I feel like when I was living in Washington, I feel like I was living in a place where people did not think they needed to think strategically, or they had forgotten how to think strategically, and that you have to think carefully about what are your means, and what are the ends, and do you have the means to achieve these ends? And just a lot of sloppy, messy thinking, leading to some extraordinary errors took place. Generally, I'm an optimist.
It doesn't sound very, very optimistic.
No, it doesn't. I know it doesn't sound very optimistic. In fact, I got so fed up with living in Washington, especially because the climate around Russia got so noxious, that moving to Bishkek and taking over a totally new kind of job to run a university sounded very exciting and appealing to me, and I'm happy to be doing that, and kind of happy not to be trying to think about foreign and security policy as much. There's not much of an audience for it. You may have met or certainly heard of the legendary Andy Marshall. Andy Marshall, the dean of the Defense Department for 40 plus years, he ran this office called the Office of Net Assessment. What the hell is the Office of Net Assessment? Well, basically, Andy Marshall was a brilliant strategic thinker, and he was allowed to have this office with a small staff and a relatively small budget and to think about things that big strategy. And I had the good fortune of meeting him a couple of times, but once in his office, I came in there when I was trying to sell the modern Silk Road strategy for Afghanistan, and he was very enthusiastic about it, but he said, the problem, Andy, is that there is no market in Washington for strategy. There's no market in Washington for strategy, for strategic thinking. It's all done on such a short-term basis. And I remember also at that time, one of a good Chinese friend who was watching very closely what I was doing in writing and talking about this modern Silk Road strategy. He said, "So, are people taking your strategy very seriously?" And I said, "Well, Wong, I'm afraid not." And his response was, "That's good." I mean, so many Chinese would ask me, or say, like, the United States is not in Afghanistan for 18 or 19 years to fight terrorists. You are there to be in the strategic rear of China and to have this strategic outpost, which I think that's a pretty good idea. Why not have a strategic outpost there? But I would laugh and answer, say, well, I wish I could tell you that was the case, but it's not.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Well, I believe there's a question from Andrei Anatольевич, but I think that let us address a couple of questions from chat. So Mary, unfortunately, I don't know the second name, addressed two questions. The first one is rather theoretical: which country now dominates more in Eurasia, China, Russia, the United States? And the second one, is it possible that China and Russia in the nearest future join their forces even more intensively to oppose America? I believe that this is about what Dmitry Trenin called Russia-China Entente in one of his reports in 2014. So in what way this Russia-China Entente is going to get transformed, and if it is going to be transformed, maybe this way of relations is satisfied everybody now.
Well, in 1997, I remember writing, for a Sino-Russian alliance to emerge, it would require a long series of huge U.S. foreign policy errors. I don't think we've made enough errors yet for that to happen. I mean, it's Sasha Lukin knows far better than I, but it is not historically traditional, I think, for Chinese to have alliance type relationships, and given that what's different from the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and what is kind of, some are talking about as a Cold War between the United States and China, it's the economic symbiosis between the two countries. That was not economic issues were not something to be concerned about, or the world economy, when thinking about the U.S.-Soviet relationship. But that certainly is a big factor in the U.S.-China relationship. And so it puts higher stakes for both sides in thinking about how far they want to go in becoming adversaries.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's give a word to Andrei Anatольевич then.
Thank you very much, dear Andrew. Thank you for your very deep analysis. And from my point of view, actually, USA and Russia and even China, to a certain extent, although Chinese policy is not so clear-cut, clearly have something like a zero-sum game towards each other in Central Eurasia, completely disregarding real challenges that the nations of the region have. And if we take your analysis, you described something like a series of changes in US policy, in the definition of US interests, in self-perception of US interests. And what can be a game changer from my point of view? Probably Afghanistan can be, to a certain extent, a game changer. For example, if US completely withdraws its troops from Afghanistan, then there is something like collapse. Then, I mean, there is a renewed situation of the end of the 1990s when we had something like near catastrophe in Central Asia, like collapse state in Tajikistan, Batken war in Kyrgyzstan, which indicated absolute absence of any real army or law enforcement in Kyrgyzstan, etc. Series of terrorist acts everywhere, etc. So can it, for example, be a game changer? Or, as you said, American policy in Central Eurasia is something like too Europe-centric now, and nothing actually happening in Central Eurasia can be a real game changer. Thank you very
much. Thanks. Great question. I think for the United States to pull its military forces entirely out of Afghanistan would be a huge strategic error. It would, as you said, it would recreate the situation of the 1990s, and it wasn't. And for it's interesting, it wasn't when Soviet troops left in 1989. That was not quite the game changer for Afghanistan. The game changer was when the Soviet Union collapsed, and then the financial support, intelligence support, and logistical support collapsed. And then Najibullah got hung from a lamppost, and things went crazy, and all other countries intervening. So even Trump has, I know in his heart of hearts, he would love to withdraw from Afghanistan. Really, his policy actually has not been that different from Obama's policy. But if there were to be a total retreat of the United States from Afghanistan, that would be, I think, a game changer for the region and very, very dangerous. And Bishkek, I would not feel as comfortable living in Bishkek. I'll put it that way. What else could be a game changer? Well, always, I think the underestimated game changer is the possibility of a nuclear conflict between India and Pakistan, which we've come close to, but here it's kind of this is an interesting case for those that think that nuclear weapons are stabilizing. I kind of think that nuclear weapons tend to be stabilizing. As soon as there were 4 major wars between India and Pakistan before both countries came out as nuclear powers, now a little more than 20 years ago, and there's not been a war of that magnitude since. But that would be a strategic game changer. I think in the longer term, a game changer is going to be, well, one of two things. I mean, 3 months ago, I would have said it's the impact of climate change. And especially if you look in Central Eurasia, the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush, the Tian Shan, the sort of area, the roof of the world, where the glaciers that supply water for billions of people those melt, and you're gonna have a very, 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 very dangerous situation. The final thing, of course, is what we're seeing right now, coronavirus. And if we saw a coronavirus on, I don't know, it's not a very nice metaphor, but coronavirus on steroids. But, you know, I mean, we haven't seen the worst of what a pandemic could be. We're getting a taste of it, but those are some things I would think of as game changers.
But in case if we have one or a combination of these game changers, can there be something like a shift in US policy? Can it become once again a kind of, I do not know, semi-ally of Russia, as it was at the beginning of 2000s when there was this counter-terrorist coalition and all these things? Can it happen once again, or there will be this new Cold War forever?
No, I don't think we're going to have this new Cold War forever. I mean, history develops, and it's really crises that are the game changers. Usually, the crises and the game changers in international relations, they emanate from wars, major wars in which change, or which kind of they change or they clarify what really is the balance of power in the world. You know, in the two world wars in the first half of the 20th century, that spelled the end of European imperial dominance of the world, and it was basically the handover, you know, economically to the United States, militarily to the Soviet Union and the United States. I think you know, we human beings our nature is to resist change. You know, we get comfortable with what we're doing, but it's crises that force us to change, and I think force us to think differently about how we relate to other people and other places.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew. We have some other questions in the chat, Roman Savinov, but I believe that maybe it would be better if people who indicated the questions in the chat address them personally. Roman,
Have them send me an email.
Yeah.
It's my anniversary tonight, and I'm supposed to cook dinner for my wife.
No, I mean, if Roman is here, I believe that he's our PhD student, then maybe he could address the question, or maybe he just, I believe we lost him probably. So
no, here.
Okay. So would you ask your question?
Yeah, right. Well, thank you for the presentation. Yeah, I'm a PhD student at the HSC doing international relations. It's my first year. So my question is pretty simple. Is there any actual US policy towards the Eurasian Economic Union, or is it not really considered in strategic deliberations?
That's a good question. The general policy since early 1990s, for the most part, was from the US government to ignore and not to recognize the existence or the significance of non-US led established multilateral organizations, especially those established by Russia. So they never wanted NATO to relate directly to the CSTO. The general view about the Eurasian Economic Union has been negative, and that this is a fig leaf for Russian economic imperialism of the other members of the Eurasian Economic Union. there's a tendency to put a kind of a worst case scenario on those organizations, or to simply dismiss them entirely as valueless. In my view on the Eurasian Economic Union is that it's too early to make a judgment. You know, when it was actually became the Eurasian Economic Union on January 1st, 2015, that was a period in which the oil price had crashed, in which a war in Ukraine was about to start. And so those were very, very difficult circumstances for the organization to get underway. I think for the organization to be successful, I've always felt this, is that the Russians need to view the organization as not a tool of their foreign policy or their imperial foreign policy, and that the organization needs to function on a consensus basis and to actually help solve problems that people have in various countries. If it does that, then it'll be more successful, I think.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I believe it is the last question in the chat from Vasily Meka. Probably he can also.
Thank you very much for your speech and for your addressing. It was very interesting. And I'm a sophomore of HC International Affairs, and my question is basically based on my coursework. And it sounds like, did the United States, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, consider the possibility of recognizing Russia's control over Central Asia in terms of Russian sphere of influence, let's say in exchange for Russia's entry into the West on favorable grounds for the latter?
No.
Never.
Very short.
Yeah, because I read some memoirs, and I know that it's not 100% true source. However, in some memoirs of Western politicians, they said about that possibility.
Well, I think there were, different politicians and advisors and commentators had different positions, but I think it would have been sort of impossible politically for any U.S. administration to kind of make a straightforward deal that would not recognize the independence of those states, which had declared themselves, maybe not always with a great degree of enthusiasm, as independent states. And as I said in the opening remarks, there was a strong urge on the part of the Bush administration to send out ambassadors there and to recognize these states as independent states as fast as possible.
Yeah, but for example, Bush's position on Ukraine was a bit different, whilst Ukraine was trying to leave Russia and finally left. That's why I'm wondering.
Well, Bush had a good relationship with Gorbachev, and he'd achieved a lot with Gorbachev, and I think him, both personally and professionally, it was a difficult decision on his part to give up on Gorbachev. He was a little bit late in recognizing things, but we also have to realize, how quickly things were changing. In April of 1991, there was a referendum all around the Soviet Union, but the majority of Ukrainians, voted to remain in the Soviet Union. But by December, that had changed. And I think then the key agent for change was the failed coup.
Okay.
Thank you.
A very deep and comprehensive answer. I believe that there are no any more questions.
Yeah, I gotta cook my wife dinner. She's gonna get mad at you.
No. Eka Hobaladze also wants to address you a question. Eka, would you like to do it on your...
Yes, if you hear me.
I do. I don't see you though.
Okay, thank you very much for presenting your attitude, but I would like to answer the question which is not dedicated to the issue directly, but nevertheless, tell me please, what's your personal attitude to Russian Great Eurasian concept? And the next question, which regional organization do you consider as most successful in Eurasian region? Thank you very much.
So what do I think about the greater Russian
concept? Yes.
I guess I'm not sure what it is. I mean, yeah, I would like to see Russia be greater.
Okay, I see.
No, but I'm not. I mean, the great Russian Eurasian partnership, or I'm not sure. So what was the second?
This concept was announced in 2016, so it's a new phenomenon in international relations. So, and what about my second question?
Sorry, repeat the second question.
Yes, which regional organization do you consider as most successful, I mean, in Eurasian region?
That's a good... Well, I think the Security Treaty Organization would be the best, of course.
CSTO? Yeah, CSTO has been the longest standing. So yeah, I think I would agree. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there are no any more questions, and I would like to thank a lot Professor Kachinc for joining us today. And
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you. Andrew,
okay. Would you like to wrap it up right now, or could I have a question as a student?
You're the last. You're the last.
Yeah, okay. I think the last.
Okay. The last thing standing between me making my anniversary dinner.
Yeah.
Okay. As a student, now coming from Western Europe, from Spain, spending a semester in St. Petersburg, this is more of a question towards you as a director of the Central Asian University. As a person that's interested in Eurasia, what do you think that are the steps to be followed, or the interests, or the, let's say, what is going to be important for future people working on the field, or any kind of personal suggestions, something like that? I thought it could be enriching to ask someone who is really working in the region and a kind of a reference.
So the question concerns what is advice to people thinking about working on the region?
Let's say, but it's kind of an open question. Just want to hear some comments or something.
Well, look, I think it's a really interesting region, and you know, Fred Starr has the concept of a greater Central Asia, including Xinjiang and parts of Pakistan and even India. But let's, you know, take out those. But what would my argument to U.S. policymakers is why the United States should, you know, strengthen relations with Central Asian states is because, you know, look where they're located. I mean, they're located amongst countries which the United States has the biggest challenges in the world: Russia, China, Pakistan, Iran. They're all there. So I think for the United States to have a greater presence there, that's from a U.S. policy centric. That's the U.S. policy centric answer. The intellectual answer is that going back to this concept of what I call Eurasia reconnecting, and that the supercontinent is reconnecting, and it's doing so very, very quickly. It's very dynamic, and a lot of it is commercially driven. And so economic and political and security relations are changing fast. And in this area in Central Asia, you're right in the middle of it. So as one friend of me said on my way out from Washington, he said, you know, Andy, that's going to be a very interesting listening post. You know, it's just going to be an interesting place to be, to actually watch to see how major powers, India, Pakistan, China, Russia, Iran, you know, are contending. And there's very dynamic, and it's really interesting. I think it's historically interesting. I think this reconnection that is taking place is something of historical significance. I mean, major historical significance.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So finally, I believe that we need to let Andrew go for his anniversary. And thanks a lot for joining us today, especially at this day. I don't think that it is the best gift which could be given, but the discussion was very fruitful, and we'll be happy to welcome you at HSC anytime, both online and offline. But
thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure for me to speak with you, and I do look forward to the opportunity to come back to the Vyshka physically, and to extend ties between the Vyshka and OUTSA, my institution in Bishkek. So best wishes to everybody. Stay healthy, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And thanks everybody for joining this seminar.
Yeah, really good questions.
Yeah, the video will be available at our website, and we will send a link if somebody wants to listen to the lecture part again.
Oh, you can send it straight to Secretary of State Pompeo.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much again. Have a nice evening.
Check it out. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Hello, son.